Hello, my name is Laura Wolfson, and I am the library director here at the Cloud Cincinnati. And we are absolutely delighted to welcome all of you to our first in-person seminar, lecture, event, whatever you want to call it, in quite some time. And we hope that you will come back and tell your friends about the rest of our very, very interesting and informative lineup for the rest of this fall. And we have even more already started planning for the spring. So that's all I want to say. And I'm going to turn this over to Abigail, and she will take care of the rest of the program.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm going to say a few quick technical introductory notes for our very many people that are on Zoom. So thank you to all our Zoom participants also. We are going to be holding questions for the end, but you can enter questions in the chat box throughout the lecture. And for all of our in-person attendees, we'll let you know when it's time to ask your questions. This event will be recorded. So again, please only share what you're comfortable sharing in a permanent fashion. And I think that's it for the technical piece of it. If you have technical difficulties throughout the lecture, please just message us in the chat box or email me at abacon@huc.edu, and we'll try to get you back online if you're having any issues. Okay, so thank you everybody for coming here. Miriam Turlinchamp, Rabbi Turlinchamp, is our moderator for today, the rabbi at Temple Beth Shalom. Thank you again for kind of spearheading this effort over here and getting us all organized and together. Rabbi Goldschmidt is here representing Congregation Shari Torah and maybe the modern Orthodox movement at large. Rabbi Kahan is the recently installed senior rabbi at Rockdale Temple, and Dr. Schwartz is here sharing his many, so is it 70, how many years?
70, gosh.
No, that sounds like too many.
You look great. You look great.
I'm 70 years old, but I've been practicing for 40.
Practicing since he was Dr. Schwartz is sharing with us the kind of medical perspective and his experience actually kind of on the ground dealing with this in his practice for many years. And I just want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today. It has been a pleasure working with you so far, and I'm very interested to hear what everybody has to share today. So thank you, and I'm going to turn things over.
Thank you so much for being here in person and online. And I so appreciate the Cloud Library inviting us into this space to share multiple perspectives. So I think what we're going to do is we'll begin by just setting the context of who we are and our own personal experiences leading our communities or our constituents or our clients, and how we're seeing reproductive health show up in those spaces, and then go into a more historical framework of what we're seeing in our country, and then sort of shift into the religious context and then sort of speak from there. So as questions come up, again, just put them in the chat or raise your hand as we go forward, and hopefully this will be less panel and more conversation, at least up here, and then sort of bringing all of you into the space. So if you could introduce yourself and to discuss sort of what the greatest concerns around reproductive health are in your community. Rabbi Goldschmidt, would you like to start?
Sure. All right, so Ezra Goldschmidt here. I'm a rabbi at Congregation Shari Torah in Amberley Village. Within Orthodox circles, I'd say there are not too many questions, certainly that I get on a personal basis. I should be more clear. I don't get any questions about abortion within members of my synagogue, at least not yet. When these things do come up to a greater degree when it comes to general reproductive health and family planning, that's the sort of question that I get more often. When is it okay to be on birth control? What kind? Those sort of circumstances, that's the sort of question that I get more often. When it comes to discussions of abortion, were it ever to come up, I would also add that that's a very heavy question that I would definitely defer to people with larger shoulders than my own within, my world. Speak to my own rabbi, speak to, people who have quite a lot of authority within our communities that, it's a serious enough question that a small fry like me can't tackle. So that's, I guess, in a nutshell, what I deal with.
Rabbi Kahan.
Hi, everybody. I'm at Rockdale Temple here in Cincinnati, proud board of HUC here in Cincinnati. In many ways, abortion and reproductive health issues manifest differently in my progressive congregational community, and I say progressive Judaism, not necessarily politically progressive community. My congregants are not coming to me for an authoritative ruling or opinion. If I have congregants or community members coming to me to talk about issues of family planning, reproductive rights, health access, abortion, they are coming for pastoral support and sometimes information on Jewish perspectives, texts on these various issues. But in our context, they're not coming for an authoritative ruling. And so as such, I would do my best to share factual information as best I can from my perspective and my knowledge base, and to provide the kind of pastoral support and then connection to appropriate resources that I could. I'll share that in the Reformed Jewish community, or at least I should speak from my own context, in my congregational community, the biggest concerns seem to be around issues of religious freedom. And what I mean by that is that my congregants are concerned that as Jews, their First Amendment rights and their understanding of the separation of church and state, that those rights are being trampled on, those separations are no longer clear in our country, and they're concerned about any number of things that are affected by that reality, and certainly about access to women's reproductive care of all people who need it, and certainly access to abortion in this particular case, and even access to contraception. Dr. Schwartz.
I'm David Schwartz. I'm an OB-GYN, been practicing for 40 years. Still doing obstetrics because I get up every day and feel that my job is a privilege. A little background: when I was a resident, I worked at Planned Parenthood, and I actually was a provider of services there, and saw a lot of different things. Picketers who would come in and termination and then go back out and picket because they thought it would never happen to them. And it really made me very firm in my belief that women have a right to choose. I'm not pro-abortion. No physician is pro-abortion. We're pro letting the woman make that decision, and we should be more interested in providing contraception and education and healthcare. And that's where we should be dealing with this issue. Currently, as you all know, the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade and the state of Pennsylvania versus Casey. Basically, what those two things were: Roe versus Wade said that nobody can prohibit abortion after the limit of viability. Viability was at one point 28 weeks and 26 weeks. Now it's 24 weeks, 24 weeks from the last menstrual period. So that actual fetus was 22 weeks along. Casey was another decision which was looking at could a spouse have an abortion without telling her husband. They permitted that to take effect, but they did not permit other things like you have to have a 24-hour waiting period, and you have to have, if you're an adolescent, you have to have your parents' permission. But more important, what happened recently is that the Supreme Court has affected the way we're able to practice healthcare. I had a patient in today who was 26 years old. She grew up in Cincinnati. She lives in Hawaii. She's here for 3 weeks visiting her family, and she's pregnant. But she went and there was no heart tones, and she was referred to me, and she has a missed abortion, it's called. Now, abortion in the medical profession is not necessarily an elective abortion. Sometimes women have a spontaneous abortion in which they have a miscarriage by themselves, or a missed abortion. They have a fetus or a fetal pole or a gestational sac, but it is not viable. Well, today I saw this woman. She needs a D&C, and I cannot do anything because I have to get a blood pregnancy test, and then I've got to wait 48 hours, get another blood pregnancy test, and get another sonogram next week. So nobody can say that there's any way, shape, or form that this was a viable pregnancy. So she has to suffer now for a week. She can't get on the plane. And why? Because what if she has a spontaneous abortion? So this is what the government has done in prohibiting or in overruling Roe versus Wade and Casey.
Thank you, Dr. Schwartz. Do you think you could please elaborate a little bit more experience on these things? I think that was really helpful to hear this particular case example. But often when we're talking about abortion in the news, or we're lay people understanding this, that we tend to think about it as choice of viable pregnancies and not about something you just talked about. How does it affect other reproductive health concerns in your patients?
Very, very good question. Let me preface answering it by saying, for a time, I performing abortions, elective abortions in my practice, not my office. When a woman wanted a tubal ligation and she was pregnant, we would go to the hospital and do the same procedure, do those procedures together. Then the hospitals prohibited us from doing that, and I referred them all to Planned Parenthood. The only pregnancy terminations or abortions we could do was Down syndrome, different types of trisomy, when there was something called holoprosencephaly, the brain was outside the skull, the fetus was not going to survive. Then about 8 years ago, all of the hospitals prohibited us from doing that too. So if a woman was carrying a child with a non-viable pregnancy, it could not be terminated. Now, if you could prove that the woman would die from a condition, severe diabetes, severe heart hypertension, there was a workaround at that time to be done in the hospital because the woman's life and health were at stake. Now, that's not the case in many states. They're working on saying one thing and doing another. You know about adolescent that was raped and had a pregnancy and had to go to Indiana, and right away saying, oh, she wasn't raped, or right away she wasn't pregnant, or was made up. Well, they found the person who did the alleged sexual assault. She got the abortion, and everybody's changing their views on it a little bit. And now the Attorney General says, well, she really could have had it in Ohio. I don't really think so. But these are the issues that we have to deal with. And if I have a pregnant woman who has severe hypertension and died with her first pregnancy and maybe had myocarditis, an inflammation of the heart, and unfortunately her birth control did not work, I have to send her out of state to get her health care now. The closest place is going to be, we think, Illinois. And so it has affected not so much us. I don't to do the abortion or to help the patient. It's the patient, although I want to, it's the patient that has to find a way to get out of town, to get her children taken care of, to get her husband to pay for it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just devastating for certain women.
And are you seeing this in preventative as well?
Well, in preventative, it does exist. We talk birth control. I'll mention something called the IUD. D stands for intrauterine device. It is a small piece of copper or silicon that's put in the uterus and prevents pregnancy. Do you know how it prevents pregnancy? It prevents implantation. So a woman who has an IUD in could be getting pregnant every month and then having a mini abortion, because this zygote that becomes an embryo that is now a tiny, tiny fetus that will sit on the head of a pin, but can't implant in the uterus. Morning after pill, exact same thing. The morning after pill is just high dose estrogen that a patient takes to destabilize the lining of the uterus so that pregnancy, that conception that just occurred, can't implant in the uterus. We in the medical profession are concerned that these are the next steps. We don't know for sure. The last point I'll just make, somebody said, well, at an ectopic pregnancy. An ectopic pregnancy is a pregnancy outside of the uterus. And there was 2 years ago, a state senator here in Ohio saying, well, we should outlaw ectopic pregnancies and have the doctors implant them in the uterus. That's totally impossible. You can't implant a pregnancy. You can implant cells that just got pregnant. That's what IVF is. But right now, doctors are concerned, well, what do I do with this pregnancy? And they're going to, and I myself too, we're going to be waiting a little bit longer, making 110% sure that this is an ectopic pregnancy and there's no way it's viable. It's close to the uterus and could survive, because we could be put in jail and fined. IVF is an issue that we're dealing with. These are all pregnancies. Once you have a viable zygote fetus, they're then frozen for a while and they may be reimplanted 5-10 years from now. What are the legal ramifications we're going to have to deal with? I'm not a lawyer. I'm just a physician, but this creates a host of issues that really individual woman should have the right to make those decisions for herself.
Thank you so much for that grounding, that experience. It's so complex right now about how we're making legislation, the fear around potential legislation, and then the veritable practice that's happening. So I'm curious, what grounds you as a Jew in the work that you're doing? How does that influence your work and your identity and moral compass?
I am very grounded as a Jew, and I believe in Judaism and follow the rules of Judaism. I was always taught that the fetus is not a person till it's a nephesh, until it crowns. So that if a woman is going to have a severe complication, I don't mind participating in the termination of that pregnancy. But that also brings it back, well, when does life? For me, life begins at conception. There's no question about it. I'll have a fetus. But just because life for me begins at conception, that doesn't mean that that woman can't decide to terminate that pregnancy if that's in her interest.
That's so helpful. Thank you. I think we'll move. No, you're perfect. We'll move to the rabbis. I think in this case of grounding ourselves in the religious context as we're related to Dr. Schwartz. And we had many questions already about the difference between the different movements in Judaism and how we're responding to these issues. So Rabbi Goldschmidt, do you think you could begin and just talk about the religious context in Jewish law or halakha?
Sure.
Please speak into the mic, Rabbi.
Sure.
Thank you.
Better.
Okay. That's the much worse mic, so you're gonna have to be much louder to you.
We'll share. We're good shares.
So this is the sort of thing that I think it's easier to have interdenominational discussions about. I think there is very often an assumption that Orthodoxy is a very right-wing, has very right-wing positions with respect to all sorts of matters of American public policy. This is not one of those where we're monolithic in any sort of way. And it doesn't even map out, I'd say, within the different subsets of the Orthodox world as to what you feel about how to categorize these things in terms of Jewish law, in terms of halakha. There are a range of opinions within Orthodox rabbinic authorities about what to consider an abortion when it's done, what is its status has the act of abortion. And I'd say one thing that does get presented, I think, accurately within Orthodoxy, by Aaron Lichtenstein, who was a great authority within the modern Orthodox world. He described it as it's never that it's totally fine and permitted. It's that inherently getting an abortion is a tragedy. It's something that we don't want to do. But many things in Jewish law, something can be prohibited, but there will be circumstances that will allow for it because it's the lesser of two evils. That's an important way to frame this. It's not, no one here, I think, at this table says, like you were mentioning before, no one is pro-abortion. It's a matter of when is it justifiable as a response to given circumstances. What answer you'll have to that question depends on how you define the act of having an abortion. There are some authorities who would go so far as to equate it to murder. And the only rationale for why it would be allowed is to save the mother's life. We have a general rule that if you see someone pursuing someone else to kill them, you are allowed to step in and defend that person. So Maimonides presented it in such a fashion that this is an act of murder that's allowed to save someone else. But then there are others who view it very differently. They see it as an act of chavala, of causing harm, wounding to another person or even to oneself. I would say within that view, I think it's important to point out also, this is also something Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein said, is that we are never pro-choice in the sense of pick whatever you as an autonomous person want to do. It's what does God want me to do? To just use a clearer example, I'm not allowed to wound myself. Forget fetuses and all of that. Just for my own self, there is no such concept of, I'm not trying to be trite here, but my body, my choice. No, it's not my body. My body belongs to God, and I can only do things to it that He allows me to do to it. So if it's causing harm, if it's chavala, causing a wound, so even that requires some justification. So even if the woman does consider it the fetus or everything that's involved in this decision-making process, her body, so still that doesn't end the discussion. That doesn't therefore lead to do whatever you want. It leads to what do my religious values compel me to do in this kind of a discussion. And then there are more minor views. There are some who say it's only a rabbinic prohibition. There are even, if you go to very early sources, this is by no means a consensus today, it doesn't reflect the mainstream at all, but there are some early sources that might even indicate that it's permitted and of no consequence. That is not how Jewish law has taken hold, as halakha has developed over time, but there's quite a range of opinions out there. But I would just say it's always about what are the circumstances that justify this act, which is certainly not a pleasant and good thing to do. It's what justifies what is unfortunately a tragedy. It's the lesser of two evils that we're looking to find. Yeah.
I'm grateful that Rabbi Goldschmidt provided a certain context and certain grounding, certainly in halakha. I think it's important to note, first of all, I want to make the statement before I say anything that I'm speaking for myself as a rabbi, and I'm speaking to some degree for my community, and can only do so, and I can provide a perspective, but this is not necessarily what all Reform rabbis would say. The halakha and the Jewish textual wisdom on this issue in particular, and many issues, is important for us as Reform Jews. That said, Reform Jews generally do not hold by halakha in the same way that Orthodox Jews may. And so it's important for us to, I think, to think about what is authoritative for us, what is guiding for us, and thinking about these kinds of words. So for me, I'll speak for myself as a Reform Jew. For me, the halakha, the wisdom of our tradition, our textual sources on this issue are guiding. They're important. They help me as an individual Jew, as an individual woman, make decisions about my life and about my body and about my family, but they are not the only pieces of information that I take into account when I'm making a decision about my family planning, about my health, et cetera. Even about my practice of Judaism, frankly, in the context of this issue or anything else. I will say that in my community and in our movement, certainly non-Orthodox Jews or progressive Jews are looking to our sources for wisdom on this issue. And we are also looking to other texts and other teachings and other Jewish values to understand this in a broader sense. So what does Judaism say about bodily autonomy? What does Judaism say about our mental health? What does Judaism say about our responsibility for our existing children or about our families, about all of those kinds of things? Is there always a definitive answer? Not necessarily. And I think it's important to note that that as Reform Jews, we often choose to be guided or inspired by halakha. We do not always choose. And again, this is a big difference in the way we think about ourselves as Jews and who we and what we are obligated to and who we are obligated to make our decisions. I can only speak for myself in saying that I do feel responsible to or obligated to God. And I do feel responsible to the teachings of our Torah and of our tradition. And that manifests differently for me as a Reform Jew. And that comes into play and into account when I or when many in my community, our community, make these types of decisions. Certainly, in my context, I am most concerned right now in the context of our world and in the state of Ohio and in our community about people in my community being able to access the reproductive health care that they need. And as a rabbi in my movement, I do not understand my rabbinic role as being that which allows me or compels me to tell other Jews what is or is not permissible to them in this situation or in many situations. I think that it's my role to provide care and counsel and contextualization, and to ultimately make sure, in my context, that a person who is facing these kinds of difficult decisions has not only the knowledge and support of her rabbi or their Jewish community, but also the support of medical professionals who can provide compassionate and knowledgeable care, and any other professionals or knowledgeable people for whom, or who in this context can provide the right kind of guidance. But ultimately, I believe as a Reform rabbi that this is a personal choice for the human being who is carrying or has the potential to carry this child. That does not mean, by the way, in my perspective, that it does not involve the input perhaps of this person's spouse, or that this person shouldn't take into account the medical knowledge of their doctor, or even the perspective of our Jewish wisdom or of their Jewish community or their rabbi, but rather that the guidance that I can provide and the knowledge I can provide is data, is information, is guidance that can be taken into account when an adult person who is facing this decision this is one set of information and guidance that they need to take into account, and they have the freedom to do so. And I believe should have the freedom to do so.
Thank you. I think we're in a rare moment where we have 3 Jews and 1 opinion. So like, that's a great first. I imagine that something that is different between the 3 of you is what you do about it. Rabbi Khan, you just focus a lot on the individual experience and the personal autonomy. And I'm curious what each of your communities or your collectives are asking you to do about this issue.
If I can start, because I think the way that I'm approaching it with an individual person is perhaps the exact opposite of how I'm approaching it with the issue with my community, which is that I think I'll let Rabbi Goldschmidt speak for himself, of course, but I would imagine that you'll hear a similar answer between the 2 of us, which is that we would, of course, speak with an individual person and their spouse when dealing with a personal situation. But my congregation, my community, and I think I can say with some authority, the broader Reform movement is asking of their rabbis, their cantors, their professionals, their synagogues, their institutions, HUC being one of them. We are being asked to act, and we are being asked to use our pulpits in all of the ways that those come, and our voices and our abilities to lift up the fact that Jewish wisdom on this issue is not the same as evangelical Christian wisdom on this issue, or the wisdom of any number of different faith traditions, or frankly, perspectives or opinions of many of our country's legislators and jurors. And we are being asked to lift our voices as loudly as possible. My congregation is begging me to preach, and I put my name on a lawsuit. Frankly, there are a lot of things that we are being asked to do, and I think, by the way, for good reason. And our movement has made statements. The Central Conference of American Rabbis has made statements. The Women's Rabbinic Network has made statements. Individual rabbis and cantors and congregations have made statements. We are being asked to speak to our communities. We are being asked to speak on behalf of our communities to the broader interfaith world and the broader secular world and civic world. And we are being asked in some cases to take legal action if there is the thought that voices from faith traditions that are not conservative Christian traditions. I don't mean to paint conservative Christians with the same brush, because that's not accurate or fair, but there are certain conservative Christian perspectives that are dominating the civic discourse or the civil discourse right now. And so those of us with different faith perspectives and a microphone are certainly being asked to speak from our faith traditions and from the wisdom and the perspectives of our denominations and our religious perspectives.
And Rabbi Goldschmidt, are you being asked something similar about your community?
No. And it's very rare that I would think to talk about it in the context of even a sermon or anything. It's very politically charged right now. I talk more broadly about the nature of discourse on the topic, the sort of thing that's not going to get anybody too upset at me. But just to echo that distinction, it's an important one for us to think about is what we do in counseling individuals who have questions about family planning or abortion is a very different discussion than advocacy for public policy. When it comes to, personal guidance and counseling, it's can be, and it should be much more personalized. If somebody says, I don't know how I can have this child because there are just so many obstacles to being able to raise it, live my life the way I need to, etc. So the way I think everybody would respond is, how can I get rid of those obstacles for you, the support that you need such that you can, carry this child? That's what we would, I think, instinctually respond when we're talking on a personal level. Public policy is a very different discussion. What is good for the country in the aggregate is a much harder question to answer. There are obviously, very sad stories of what can occur when you're a blunt tool, that is the law, that the doctor was mentioning before. But that doesn't necessarily tell you what to do with respect to public policy. Another element of it is you can have within the Orthodox world rabbis who have very strong opinions in terms of seeing abortion as terrible and hardly ever justifiable. And then at the same time, they'll have a very liberal stance on what you should therefore advocate in terms of public policy. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein was one of the strictest when it came to defining abortion. He felt that it was an act of murder. And at the same time, I think you can make a very good argument that he was one of the most liberally minded when it came to, let's keep our religion out of American public discourse and advocacy for public policy. When it came to not this issue, but end of life issues, he had a certain perspective about how to navigate those things. And he was asked, so what should we Jews as a political body, obviously we're composed of a lot of different people, but what should we do? Let's say the Agudath Israel that represents people who would want to express Rav Moshe Feinstein's preferences. What should we do in terms of American public policy and advocacy in that regard? And he said, don't touch it. What I want, I would want the advocacy for people to have the rights to consult their moral and religious authorities about what to do in all of these situations and to have the autonomy to do that. Because I don't want to live in a world where religion is infringing on politics and then the blowback is inevitable of politics infringing on our religious preferences. So we're staying out of this. He would very likely say the same thing about abortion policy. He could have his own opinions about it, but knowing that there's other opinions within the Orthodox world, he doesn't want the arm of the secular government to, so to speak, paskin, rule like him necessarily. And for non-Jews in the world at large, he didn't feel that we should be dictating how they should be navigating this. So that's an important distinction to make. And I think that informs a lot of why the Orthodox world has not been so vocal with respect to what's been going on in current events. You'll see various statements made from organizations that I think can do their best to capture that nuance. But ultimately, it's not something that we see as a major goal of advocacy. To a much greater degree, the advocacy just trends with, please give us the freedom to do things the way we would want to. We understand other people will choose very differently from the way that we would. But ultimately, that's what we want so that we have our religious liberty.
And I think that is, and so our denominations come at this very differently. And it's for that precise reason, I think that the reform movement in its comfort in political spaces and in public spaces is advocating and speaking the way that our movement and our various organizations and leaders is for precisely the reason that Rabbi Goldschmidt articulated so beautifully, which is that we might do things very differently than someone else or, a person with another faith background. So all the more so, we should then have the religious freedom in this country then to do what is permitted and necessary by the understanding of our faith.
I just want to talk about two experiences I've had. One was 40 years ago when I first went into practice, and for a woman to get a sterilization, she had to get permission in my office and the hospital I was working at from her husband. And I had a patient who husband wouldn't do it. She ended up having her 9th baby and almost died during that pregnancy. And I said I would never do that again. What I do is I would talk to the patient and hope that she can have a proper discourse with her husband, and together they can come to the decision that will be the right decision. More recent, this is like counseling that the physician would do. More recently, I had a 16-year-old girl from Mount Notre Dame, just over the river in northern Kentucky, who found out she was pregnant. I delivered her 16 years ago. Her mother's still a patient of mine. They are extremely Catholic, and they came in asking me what they should do. Should they get an abortion? And I sat and talked to them for a while. And one of the issues was she was going into her junior year. And once she starts showing at Mount Notre Dame, she's not allowed to be at school. And I said, look, you guys have to make the decision yourself. I cannot make any of these decisions for you. I can direct you to the appropriate resources. But what I would do is go back and talk to the school and see if we can get that changed, and see if you can go to class and show them that you're responsible. And yes, this was an accident and a bad outcome, but let's turn it into a good outcome. And that's exactly what they did. They went back to the school, and she is now about 30 weeks pregnant and in classes and goes to school every day. And so her junior year isn't going to be such a disaster as it could be. And I'm just bringing this up because as counseling and what we do as physicians, Jewish people, Catholic people, what we have to do is give them the options, give our patients the options, educate them on all the issues, and then hopefully they can come to the right decision. Be a resource for them so they can then make that decision.
I think that's perfect. Is there a way that any of the three of you prioritize those conversations? That what are the factors that you're seeing when people are struggling, and how do you, I mean, that was a little bit more clear in terms of that case study, that you're a young person who needs to complete school, and how do we sort of solve this by non-medical means? But are there other things that come up that you have to help people decide or make these choices in any of your professions? Go ahead. Yeah.
And like I said at the beginning, I've never had to, even closer, yeah, okay. Like I said before, I've never had to actually deal with an abortion question in my years in the rabbinate so far. But family planning questions are the kinds of things I get. And one of the things that a rabbi does in Orthodox circles, at least, is helps in counseling and sorting out what is a good reason to not have more children right now, and what is not such a great reason. To use an example, if they said we'd rather get a pet, that's not going to quite do it for us. And that, but obviously there's things that are more gray. There are people who will say the financial burden is too difficult for us. Even then, what does that mean? Does that mean I can't put away as much in my 401k as I would have liked? That I'd be a little bit more hesitant to say, all right, fine, go on the pill. Whereas if it's a family that's in actual dire poverty, that's a much more real claim to make to justify contraception. Something that I think I didn't articulate before, but one of the values that we have in family planning is that it's considered a mitzvah, a positive commandment for at least for Jewish men to father children, to have a boy and a girl. So and then more children beyond that is considered praiseworthy and a very good thing. So there needs to be justification to allow for contraception going up against that value. Some reasons are better than others, and that's where the counseling, I think, plays a role.
I don't have a great answer for this question. I think largely because again, we're coming from a different context where if someone is coming to me for this conversation, whether it's about family planning or it's about contraception or it's about abortion, whatever it may be, first of all, certain of these conversations are just fewer and far between in my context. In 10 years, I have never had a conversation with someone about whether or not as a Reformed Jew or as a Jew, it's okay for them to use contraception. It's just not a conversation. Now, I shouldn't say that none of my Reform rabbinic colleagues have not had that conversation. I'm sure they have. Somebody had somewhere along the line, but I have not. It's not a typical conversation in our context, but certainly wrestling with a difficult decision around abortion is a conversation that does happen in our world and in the privacy and the trust of, of a rabbinic congregant or rabbinic community member relationship. And again, this might be the social worker in me, even more than it's the rabbi in me, but ultimately it's about, for me, pastoral care and creating the space for an individual to articulate not only their values, but the realities of their life and the intricacies of their relationship. Are they in a safe marriage? That is a real factor, right? For someone who has always lived in a safe marriage and was modeled a safe marriage and a safe home, right? What is in my worldview of what somebody's reality is might not be their reality. Is someone able to finish their education and go on to have a productive life where they do have financial stability? Does someone have other children at home and they don't believe that they can care meaningfully for another child or continue to care for the children that are already in their life? Is someone dealing with a medical situation where this would be a threat to their ability to get through meaningfully their daily life going forward, or even threaten their life in carrying a pregnancy? These are all the things that we would talk about, we could potentially talk about, but ultimately there is not, I should say that I don't believe that there is a set of values that I would prioritize in having the conversation. The values and the factors that I would prioritize in the conversation are those that the individual or the family would bring to me. And it's my hope that as their rabbi and as their counselor, I would be able to help them have a meaningful conversation about those things.
Abigail, I just want to time check with you about how much time we have, because I'd like to go to questions.
Let's start with taking any questions in the audience. We have so many questions.
So many
by Zoom.
questions. Okay, and I also want the panelists to be able to ask each other questions. So why don't we start here in the in-person setting? Are there people who have questions? Dr. Meyer?
I have a question for Rabbi Goldschmidt. Is there in the responsive literature a discussion of the pregnancy brought on by rape or incest?
I just want to, we would repeat it to the mic.
Sure. The question that was asked was in the responsive literature, meaning the question and answer format that many rabbinic authorities write in. Is there any discussion about rape and incest playing a role with respect to these things? So yes, on a couple of levels. One of them is just simply, if you take the premise that you need to have a pikuach nefesh context to justify an abortion, meaning a threat to the mother's life to allow for this. Let's say you're working within that paradigm. Rape and incest are circumstances that can very much militate towards having an abortion for the following reason. Those are very traumatic experiences that will be in many ways much more a part of this woman's life if a child is born from that act. And it puts a lot more stress on a woman in a way that suicide is a much more significant possibility than your average case of abortion being considered. And then it's just, I know people very often think about this in much more like, so to speak, non-psychological perspectives, but psychological perspectives are important when we talk about threats to life and all of that. So those circumstances are ones that can much more militate towards an abortion on those grounds. Another reason why that could play a role is if you don't assume such a high bar to reach in order to justify an abortion. Like I said before, some don't see it as an act of murder. They see it as something lesser, for which the bar is lower. Then rape and incest are circumstances where the child is, gives off a certain, I don't know how I would say this accurately. It has a certain presentation towards the mother that is far less pleasant than a typical birth that, can clear that bar. Yeah. To use just one technical example, it's not about rape or incest per se, We have the concept in Jewish law of the mamzer, of someone who's born out of various forbidden unions, having certain Jewish law obstacles of who they can marry, other factors as well. That is something that some authorities say, if the child will be a mamzer, then they'll consider that to be circumstances which justify an abortion. Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you. That's interesting.
What else?
I just, I wanted to just, sort of raise, I've lived with my husband for 48 years. I'm married to Dr. Schwartz. This issue has been a part of the fabric of our lives from the early years that he was performing abortions at Planned Parenthood. We were picketed every Saturday morning in front of our home in Wyoming, Ohio. Our children grew up seeing this. We had a lot of conversations about it. They were very young. We explained that this was the right of these people to protest. Yeah, it wasn't great that it was on our sidewalk, but we weren't going to call the police. We were not going to engage with them, ride their bikes down the driveway and go play on the street and come back to the picket line. And the people in the line were always polite, and there was nothing ever happened. It was just an experience that they endured growing up. And personally, I believe in a woman's right to choose. But where I am right now in my head with where we are as a country, which has been alluded to in most of your remarks, all of your remarks, really, is that this issue has now become an issue of religious freedom. And it's terrifying to me that this is the value that this country is founded on. And I feel that this has now gone beyond whether it's a woman's right to choose or who gets to help make the decision or who gets to be part of the decision. It's truly an issue that of our religious freedom being at stake as we look at where we are going with this and where it lines up in terms of who is in the camp of forbidding it and those who believe it should not have anything to do with the government. So what do I do with that? I mean, it's just terrifying.
I'm just gonna repeat that terribly into the mic for those of us who are online. So Abby is just speaking as the wonderful curator of the museum here, but also as the partner of Dr. Schwartz and experiencing regular protests in front of their home on Shabbat and sort of how that's fabric of our lives and the bifurcation of the world that we're living in terms of being very separated and divided by the decisions that are happening in the government. And the question is, what do we do about it? That was the question. Yeah, it came up on the online too. So do you have any solutions? I mean, you're talking about decades of facing this and having to speak in a non-binary world, right? You still have to work with people and experience people who do feel very differently about the things that you're doing intimately every day. So I'm curious, just as a person, how you've dealt.
It is a religious issue because certain religions have their feelings and I respect their feelings. I do my deliveries at Good Samaritan Hospital. We're not allowed to provide birth control at Good Samaritan Hospital. We're not allowed to do sterilizations at Good Samaritan Hospital because it's a Catholic hospital. In Northern Kentucky, there is no institution, no hospital where you can perform a sterilization because they're all Catholic hospitals. But I respect that because that's how they feel and they have the right to that. But they shouldn't be telling me or you what to do if you want to be sterilized. And if you want an abortion or if you want certain type of birth control, you should be permitted to do that. So I feel it is, like Abby said, a religious liberty issue that is very scary what's going on, especially since our Constitution, and again, I'm not an attorney or a constitutional scholar, was written over 250 years ago by men, and things are very, very different now. We need to change a lot of things and incorporate women and incorporate the things that we now have in the 22nd, 23rd, whatever, 21st century. They didn't have birth control 250 years ago. They didn't have abortions. They didn't have women working. And so things are very different now. And somehow we need to get back to the basics and change it legally.
Thank you. We have many questions. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, please.
I mean, for myself, I think that sometimes there are category errors that people are making with respect to that kind of a concern about religious liberty. One of us gave an example before we got together formally today is, would you consider it something which gets in the way of religious liberty if that in America, polygamy is forbidden by law, right? I don't think many of us would, right? Because there's no religious mandate to have a polygamous relationship. It's highly inadvisable religiously also, but there are certain Jewish communities that allow for it. I wouldn't, yeah, in the Sephardic world, it is technical. I mean, it doesn't happen too often, don't get me wrong, but it is not prohibited. In the Ashkenazic world, there is such a concept of it being subject to a cherem. It's totally forbidden now post Talmudic stuff. I'm not going to get bogged down with the details, but I don't have an obligation to have to be in a polygamous relationships. So I wouldn't see that as infringing on my religious rights that they forbid that. If they were to make a law that forbids my ability to put on tefillin every morning, that I'd have a problem with, because that is something I'm mandated to do every day, and you're telling me I can't do that now. So when it comes to abortion, it's important to know that in many circumstances, Judaism allows for it as opposed to requiring it. So is it considered an infringement upon religious liberty to say that this thing that you can do is now forbidden? No, in the same way that polygamy being forbidden is not an infringement on my religious rights either. Now, there are certain circumstances where Jewish law would say you must have an abortion if there's a threat to your life, mom, so you better have an abortion. If there were laws that were prohibiting abortion in those circumstances, then I'd be jumping up and down and saying, yes, religious liberty is very much being sacrificed here. But I think it's important to understand the distinctions. What you can do and versus what you have to do, what you should do in Judaism, makes a very big difference in terms of how you view it as to whether or not religious liberty is being infringed upon.
And I would respond to my colleague, Rabbi Goldschmidt, and we've already actually had this conversation, so we're just now having it in the microphone, which is that, which is to Dr. Schwartz's examples earlier, it may not be on the books in too many places that there is no exception for the life of the mother, but in practice, because of the environment that's been created in our country and the fear that has been rightly felt by physicians and providers, that we have effectively created a situation in many, many places in our country where people whose lives are being physically threatened are not in the right amount of time or in safe circumstances able to access an abortion in a case where Jewish law would say that it's needed. Now we have a problem. And so in the black and white, it may not be the case, but in the gray reality of the world that we live in, it may be the case in many situations. And that's one of the many things that I fear as a rabbi who works with real people every day, right? We live in a real world, which is also very messy, a messy world.
Okay. So here's one of the questions that are coming from our online community right now. In Judaism, can the fetus enjoy the resurrection of the dead?
I'm not going to touch that. You're welcome to.
No idea. I mean, I'll just say in general, resurrection of the dead, the parameters of that as a concept before you even get into fetuses is, fraught with controversy and debate.
What about the afterlife in general?
They're also, we've never been there. We don't know entirely what it looks like there. Maimonides talks about a lot of these things and saying we have certain ideas about the next world being good, a messianic era being a good thing. How exactly is it so? How exactly does it work in terms of the mechanics? we don't have any firm traditions on those things.
So we don't mean to giggle at that question at all. It's more about that it's so nuanced in these ways. So perhaps one other way to ask that question might be, at what point do we see a fetus as having a soul, or do we even see it in that way? And I think Dr. Schwartz actually kicked us off in the very beginning, sort of with his own belief set and how that works. And so maybe something like that with citation would be helpful.
By citation, what do you mean?
Like they just want to know where it's from. They want to know.
Like where in the Talmud is the discussion about the crowning, like whole discussion that he
Yeah,
had?
that's what they want.
Off the top of my head, I'm not sure I know it
I
exactly,
think I
but it's
have
a
it here.
Mishnah.
Hold on,
Mishnah.
hold on, hold on, hold on.
Mishnah in Horiot, I believe.
Oh, good.
I believe it's a Mishnah in Horiot, but I'm not entirely sure. There is a Mishnah that discusses, I don't think I'm going to do much more justice to it than Dr. Schwartz did, that says when a woman is on the mashber, when she is on the birthing stool, she's in the process of giving birth. So until the child's head begins to emerge, if there is a threat to the mother's life, then the fetus can be aborted to save that mother. But once the child's head emerges, then it is one life against the other in a way that we can't mission Erican. There you go. Okay. Then at that point, we have to let nature take its course, and neither life is considered one that we can choose over the other. That's a very important classical source with respect to this. That at the very least gives you justification for abortion when the mother's life is threatened. There might be more leniency than that, but at the very least, it tells us about that case.
Are there any questions that we haven't hit yet? Go ahead.
I can't believe I'm having this discussion now. I remember before Roe v. Wade. But several years after, maybe 20 years, 30 years ago, I was part of a discussion with similar to this. And the Orthodox rabbi said, and I'm just wondering if Rabbi Goldschmidt, you could relate to this or you agree with this, that the reason one of the reasons he was so against any laws coming down from the state was because as an authority, he and Orthodox rabbis had an authority to sit with the doctor and perhaps with other rabbis and if necessary, make a decision. And that decision would be totally taken away. That authority would be taken away from an Orthodox rabbi if the state says something else. How do you relate?
Do you want to repeat that?
The question, I think, if I'm paraphrasing correctly, is it accurate to say that Orthodoxy is worried about abortion rights being taken away because it strips power away from rabbis and puts it in the hands of the state? Yeah, I mean, I would say not power away from the rabbis, say power away from God. That they're mentioned before. Why do we not want to get involved in public policy on this issue? Because the widest berth for people to make their own choices, including religious Jews being able to ask their religious authorities for what to do, is something that is desired. I'd say the Orthodox world is not monolithic in this regard. I was describing one of those views. You'll see on the opposite spectrum, the Lubavitcher Rebbe was very in favor of trying to advocate for American law to more closely correspond to Jewish law, especially as it pertains to things that relate to B'nai Noach, to non-Jews, because we believe non-Jews have a lesser amount of responsibilities than Jews do, but they have responsibilities for which abortion very much matters. So that's a different perspective that is there. But I think what's considered mainstream within the Orthodox world is the other view, is we'd like to have a wide berth for leeway to make our own religious decisions.
I think one important thing just for the online community is what Rabbi Meyer prefaced her question with was, I can't believe I'm having this conversation again. And I think that is something that we're encountering in this flux between our democracy, our American identity, and our Jewish identities, and how that's manifesting in the intimate ways that we're each dealing with in our own ways, and also in this global or political spectrum that we're trying to navigate and obviously see differently. Any other questions or thoughts that you want to bring forward? Go ahead.
Very beginning, I sensed a real commonality, almost the dilemma that all three of you are facing with what's happening with the current climate. You no longer have access to the full range of tools that used to be available to you. And that puts you in your obligations that all three of you obviously feel very keenly to the people who are turning to you. And you've now had, you're working with one hand or more tied behind your back. And as someone who might be coming to one or more of you or person in your position, it makes me very frightened for, given my age, not my personal options, but for those of my children and grandchildren and my acquaintances. And I grew up in an era, or matured in an era, where I had a great deal of freedom, being older than but a bit younger than Grandma Meyer. I said just a bit.
Should we stand in the line?
But what I'm saying is it's terrifying even to someone who's not personally in it. And I can only imagine how you all feel when people are coming to you and looking at you. And you're a little bit you're floundering, I imagine. How are you dealing with that?
So let me just repeat it into the microphone for our folks online. So one of the things that she saw was a commonality amongst the panelists that that our resources and our ways of being have been limited recently. And as we're starting to support the different constituencies that we work with, that we are struggling with one hand behind our back. And she went to reiterate that for herself, this isn't a particular personal concern, and yet she is terrified for her own children, her grandchildren, and I would say, you had said, right, women, but I would say peoplehood, just what does it mean for our whole people? And so the question was, well, how are you doing? How do you do it, and how are you doing?
Well, what I didn't say, and I meant
Sorry.
to say,
Mhm.
I'm sorry,
No.
is that you all want to remove the obstacles for people to achieve the best result for them. And that's what you're no longer able to do within your own belief system or what you believe is the best way to achieve the outcome. And that's where
Let me so I can repeat it for these guys. So you all want to remove the obstacles in order to best serve the people and their needs, and that just feels limited now. Is that correct?
that's my interpretation.
Yes, thank you. So I think Dr. You want to go?
I mean,
Go ahead.
I mean, I'm going to play a little devil's advocate here. I don't know what I think about that, but I definitely think there can be a push in the other direction. I think there are plenty of rabbis who would consider it a very worthwhile trade-off to say, I'll have my hands tied behind my back and I'll have lesser ability to guide people to make the right decisions for them. But I think it's a worthwhile trade-off. Again, when I say I don't mean me right now. I don't know what I think, but maybe some would say it's a worthwhile trade-off for the fact that many more children will be born in the world. And you know, that's the complexity with public policy. I know we talk about tragic scenarios of women who should be getting an abortion, not being allowed to have it, but something that very often it gets unsaid in the way that people frame these discussions is, what about the unborn? And, you know, that's not necessarily a trade-off that people are upset about losing. And I think there are many rabbis who would advocate for that. So that's an important thing to discuss. It very often goes unsaid, and I wish it would be talked about more in the overall discussions of these things.
I certainly can't speak for all of my colleagues, but I think I'm comfortable saying that for the majority of my reform movement colleagues, we wouldn't frame it in the same way. We're placing less value, we have less concern about the potential lives, which are still very sacred and very special as potential life, than we are concerned about those living, breathing, existing adults who are carrying those children and have all of the vulnerabilities existing there. That said, I don't mean to crack a joke about this, but I will a little bit, which is not only do I think your characterization is correct, but I will also say, frankly, this is making a lot more work for me. And it's funny, and it's not, echoing what Rabbi Meyer said. Should she be fighting the same fight she was 50 years ago? When I gave a sermon after this decision was handed down earlier in the summer, I had a congregant, almost 90, sitting in the second row, and she glared at me the entire sermon. And I thought the whole time, I'm not unhappy I gave this sermon. This is the sermon I needed to give. This is the sermon that my congregation needed to hear from me. And I'm not sorry. And I know I'm going to hear about it when I step off the bema in 20 more minutes. I stepped off the bema in 20 more minutes. And this congregant gave me a big hug and said to me, I can't believe my granddaughter is fighting this fight. I am bereft. And thank you for talking about it from the bema. So, lesson for me not to assume what my congregant's facial expressions mean, but seriously, more importantly, the Jewish community, and I say that broadly, and obviously I shouldn't paint everyone with the same brush, but Jews and a whole lot of other individuals and communities and faith communities have been dealing with this issue for a very long time. And I know that for so many of our communities, we are bereft that this fight is back on our plates and in our hands.
I think we're allowed to agree to disagree. So Rabbi, I just want to say that I think there's two sides to that story. This is science, this is medicine. And if we look at what happened prior to January 23rd, 1963, or 63 or 70, I guess.
72?
73, thank you. Women who wanted abortions got abortions, but they were back alley abortions, they were illegal abortions, and they became sterile, they died, and it was a horrible experience. I was alive, but I wasn't practicing medicine then. But more recently, the country of Ireland has more liberal abortion laws than we do in this country. A number of years ago, abortion was illegal in Ireland. And already they've seen a turnaround in the health and safety of women and children. And just to say that, well, we're going to see more children, the women who want an abortion are going to get an abortion. Let's make it safe and legal. The women who need an abortion because of health are going to get an abortion. Let's make it safe and legal. But let's do everything we can to minimize the need for abortion, as I said earlier, and provide education and provide contraception and provide resources to take care of these children so that woman who has 3 or 4 or 5 kids can't afford the 6th one, we provide something for her to have it. That would be a better way to go.
We're having fun.
Exactly.
I would just say, like, I think are instances of that occurring, back alley abortions going horribly wrong, a reality? Of course they are. But once you're talking in the aggregate, is there accurate and good data that tells us what is the greatest good for society? It's very hard to come by. I'm sure just as there are the horror stories, there's also people who would otherwise not have been born that were born. What ratio is that between those circumstances and these circumstances? I don't think we have enough solid data. Something that I did speak about in my synagogue, which is pretty rare to talk about this as a hot button issue, is just in terms of the way that we talk about this. It's, I think, unfair when we focus on anecdotes. There are, yes, tragic circumstances on both sides of, you've heard of the thing which happens to not be true of, like, you would have killed Beethoven. You've heard of that anti-abortion argument, but that is pulling at the heartstrings to, make you want to forbid abortion. And then there's also the very real tragic circumstances of many horror stories that we just heard about today. But a conversation that is an honest conversation is policy, and the blunt tool of law is never going to be perfect for everybody. But what is going to, in the aggregate, create the greatest good? I don't know the answer to that, but that's the more important question. Small data points are not going to inform the entire process here, and that's not I don't think it's an honest conversation.
I'm gonna tilt it, can I tilt this? a
But
little?
Abby, can you do it in a mic? Because you're gonna like
Oh,
preach in
okay.
a second. And I just want you to preach into a mic.
Okay.
Well,
So I guess from,
so let them see it.
where do I go? Okay.
I just want them to see your good side.
From a Jewish perspective and, you know, a human perspective, I guess where I really have the most pain is that I have a daughter, I have a granddaughter. Whatever she will need medically, ever in her life, we will be able to provide. Somebody will be able to provide. I have such fear for people who are not in the circumstances that I would guess many people in this room are. And that they're the same people who live in food deserts. They're the same people who, for a trip to Illinois, if the decision needed to be made that they needed to go to Illinois, they might not be able to get to Illinois. So whatever your perspective is on this, what can the rabbinic community, our own communities of our lay people in our congregations do to make sure that those women are getting the attention and the care that they need? Because that's what keeps me up at night.
I knew I was right to give you the mic.
So if I can just make a general plug, and then people can do with this information what they wish. The National Council of Jewish Women, ncjw.org, is really leading this work in the progressive, moderate Jewish communities spaces. And there are a lot of resources there. There are a lot of suggestions for how you can get involved, how you can take action. Yes, one of the top recommendations for what you can do if this is an issue that you feel strongly about in terms of abortion access and reproductive healthcare access is to donate to some verified and trusted abortion funds. That's how the person who is not well-resourced gets to, unfortunately, Illinois if they need to, and a lot of other ways too. But I would, rather than parsing each of the what can we do's, if I may lift up that particular resource that has a Jewish lens. It doesn't have the only Jewish lens and obviously the only Jewish voice on this, but a trusted Jewish voice, well organized and well verified, where you can find a lot of information and resources should this be an issue that you want to take action on in terms of creating more access.
Just to add one more thing, I think it's also very reasonable, not mutually exclusive answers at all. You can also do what you can to fund crisis pregnancy centers. You can also try to provide resources for the people who, for reasons that you can help solve, allow them to give birth at term. So it's not a one size fits all answer, but everybody needs help and they can get help in different ways. And it shouldn't be seen as an either or.
Okay. We got really fun at the end there. That's great. Thank you, Abigail, for bringing this nuanced and complex issue, which we both all agreed on and disagreed on at the same time, which is perfect and appropriate for this institution to be celebrating in this kind of way and take action in all the different ways that you've seen it. Thank you for your precious time. It's a hard road that we're in right now. For being here, and for all of you for taking time to make this issue something that is pertinent in your lives, and we hope to take action. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ezra.
Thank
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thanks for making it fun.